Hi, welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Hyman, and I am here with your Sales SOS podcast crew, Daryl Prowl, Chris Bowen, Mike Simmons, Bryn Tillman, and Renee Bigelow. And today we're going to be talking about sales compensation and um, motivating sales teams to do what you want them to do. And I think this is a super important topic. And I've been having this conversation a lot lately. My sales team isn't doing what I want them to do. Should I compensate them differently? So I think let's just kind of start with what are the things that sales teams are looking at, facing. What are the things that get them thinking about how they're going to behave, what decisions they're going to make, and how they're going to prioritize. And then in the next couple of episodes, we can dive into some of these topics. But I want to start by throwing out a couple of thoughts. And one is um, this whole idea of as a salesperson, there are so many things that can get in the way of my selling, right? So if I want my sales organization to sell, one of the things that I have to do before I talk about compensation, before I talk about anything else, is I have to talk about how do I help my sales team actually have time and space to sell. And right now in the United States, 90% of salespeople are dissatisfied with their job, and 70% of those are looking for a new job. And what they say, and I can't remember where this came from, but what the study showed was that they were complaining about things like called drag, things that we refer to as drag. And drag would be things like the amount of time it gets for the internal team to approve or put together a proposal, the number of different apps I have to use in order to get my job done, the amount of time I spend in meetings that aren't relevant to what I'm trying to accomplish as a salesperson. These kinds of things that get in the way of salespeople doing their jobs. So if we start with this sort of premise of if we want salespeople to sell, then we have to enable them to sell. And we have to understand that when they are not able to sell, when things get in the way, they get disappointed, they get frustrated, and they don't want to sell. So we are later going to talk about compensation, but compensation only can do so much. So let's talk a little bit about, again, we've done this before, a day in life of the salesperson. What are they doing? What should they be doing, and how do we help them do that?
Can I, before we get into that, I just want to yes and something you said. I just took an SEL course, and there was an exercise where we talked about what the exercise was. What do you believe your buyers are searching for? My buyers are sales professionals and leaders, right? And so I thought they were looking for how to build a better pipeline, how to prospect better. Like I had a whole list. They were all really far down. The two, and I think Liz, we talked about this, the two terms that came up. Number one, how do I manage up to a narcissistic boss?
Yep.
And the second one is how do I navigate a toxic work environment? So I just want to share. So I actually am now on a mission and writing a book for 2026. And my potential TEDx is The Narcissistic Salesperson and the Journey to Recovery. But before we talk about like, what does the day look like? What are they walking into and feeling? So that's all I have to say about that.
What do you guys think?
I mean, I think Bryn has hit on something that I think is not just limited to sales. It's if I have to look at a conversation that I've had with my employees, whether they're sales, marketing, or other, and those people that I've mentored over the years, it's pretty much what Bryn just alluded to, which is I cannot get excited to go to work for a toxic environment. I cannot. I'm having a hard time motivating myself to do the work because I feel like no matter what I do, my boss is going to tell me I did it wrong. I didn't do it their way. I didn't do it at the time. I feel like we have these conversations and they nod their head and they totally ignore it and they never follow through. So over and over and over again, the advice I'm giving to people, first and foremost, is not how to be a better marketer, not how to be a better salesperson. It's how to be a better employee, how to manage up. I love that you talked about, the narcissistic boss. Oh my God, that is like overwhelming. And it's not limited to like CEOs. Like it could be a sales manager. All right. I became the manager because I was a rock star sales rep, even though I've got zero management skills and now I'm effing up something fierce across the board. But I don't know that because my ego is too big for me to see it. But everybody else is collateral damage. How do I motivate myself for that? So I think people skills, management skills, empathy, the whole idea of actually, understanding that you got to where you're at as a leader because of your raw skills, but now you need to develop a whole new set of skills. And if you do that, your team will perform better, needs to be there in the sales training. And rare do I ever see that.
Who will pay for it?
The company. I mean, think about just retention. How much does it cost to replace an employee? How much does it cost on your reputational damage? How much does it cost you on misperformance numbers because the people aren't motivated or they're annoyed or they're upset? It's an investment, no different than you would invest in a computer or a cubicle or whatever else it might be.
Do you think people really will pay for that?
That's a different question.
So I think they'll pay for it if it's a priority for them. But if the boss is a narcissist, there has to be a good enough ROI for them to decide to pay for it because that's all they think about. So, I mean, as I go through, and Liz and I had such a discussion around this because it is, I think the narcissistic salesperson, the narcissistic sales leader, it's all about so we'll talk about KPIs that matter to me as a company, that matter to my shareholders, but it's not about what matters to the buyer. It's not about so do they care? If they're narcissists, they're only going to care about how it impacts them. However, if they are on a journey to bring value to their marketplace, and I'm working with there are some sales leaders that they've made a lot of money. The companies have made a lot of money and they want impact. They want to make sure that they are showing up in a way that builds a better reputation, that doesn't create the fear in the marketplace that they're being scammed, that they're being sold a bill of goods, right? That they build a trust-based reputation. They will care, and if they know they have to make an impact, they will implement. It is still probably a very narrow group of people, but the last thing I'll say on that is if you want to differentiate yourself in the marketplace, care about your buyers. That will differentiate yourself. That's how bad it is out there. Yep. So that's my thing.
I shifted my business.
Whoops.
I shifted my business last year and really started focusing on leadership. Now I tried to be half pregnant, so to speak, and do leadership and sales at the same time. And we know that doesn't work. In October, I changed everything and primarily focused on the leadership stuff. And I can tell you, it is very hard to find people who will pay for this. Based on my experience as a high-performing revenue professional who knows how to sell, it is very hard to find people who are willing to pay for these things. And there's so much technical debt, organization debt that we've taken on over the years that has gotten in the way of it. This includes the short amount of time that leaders are in roles. Anybody know what the average lifespan of a VP of sales is today?
It's less than 18 months, isn't it?
Less than 18 months.
It's more than marketing.
It keeps shrinking. I've seen data that shows that it's as low as 14 months. I've not seen it get down to a year. Here's the unfortunate thing.
But if you're talking about that
one, typically have some kind of a comp plan where they structured things where there was a way for them to earn out and exit. So the likelihood of them actually either being given notice is that it happened in under a year. And I think it's cool that we're all talking about leadership stuff, which is really important to me. It's core. It's core to how we're successful in business, and it's what sales is. Sales is an act in service of others. It's an act of leadership. It helps people move forward. One of the core skills is problem solving, and one of the challenges here, though, is many times we go out there and I'll again, this is something I'm excited and passionate about. We go out there and we start looking for other people to lead us. And that's the wrong way to do it. Leaders build leaders. Leadership starts with self. Leadership is how we move forward. Start building your own leadership of self capabilities, which includes communication, design, goal setting and execution, decision making, and problem solving, core skills like the ones that folks have been talking about. I think the biggest challenge you're going to run into for anybody listening to this who's excited about it and is thinking about leading up or managing up or communicating up, you need to invest in it on your own because no one's coming to do it for you. And you've got to make a choice. Is that what you want to do? And do you want to build the future leaders of tomorrow? Or do you want to whine, complain, bitch and moan about the people who are operating in leadership roles that we promoted into those roles because they really were good individual contributors, but they didn't know what leadership was before they moved into it.
But what you're getting at, and I 1,000% agree, is there has to be an intentional, conscious effort by either senior leadership or even sales leadership to create that culture. And I do agree that if we're self-aware enough to understand that's what makes a successful organization, it starts there. Then we have to lead that way. The issue, of course, and now I'm stating the obvious, that we face is that, and I'm going to be totally stereotypical here. I'm sorry, folks. There's too many tech bros and tech gals that want to talk to each other and slap each other on the ass and tell us how great we are and how nobody else isn't as smart as we are, and then go back and just, talk nonstop and spew, which is the opposite. And those people are not self-aware enough to ever create that culture. So
why are they not self-aware?
Because they're insecure, but that's just what Dr. Darrell says.
Well, if you go back and you look at when HubSpot was, I'll say, growing pretty fast and still relatively young, one of the things they realized was everybody that worked there was essentially their friend, right? They were all roughly the same age, things like that. And Brian Hannigan ended up being like, we have to change this up because there's no doubt that we're missing pieces of both the opportunity, but also things that we need to do internally in order to grow, because we all sound alike. We all think the same way, and made a conscious effort to make that type of shift. I don't know how long that has stuck or if it still has stuck, but I always found the perspective interesting of being able to step back a little bit and say, hey, what's the gap from really where we're at to where we need to be, and what would we have to change in order to make some of those things happen? And I don't think enough organizations do that, and it's not a short journey. So it's if you're public, trying to hit quarterly numbers and do those types of things becomes real challenging.
So hang on just a second. So what we're saying is that if we want our sales people, our sales executives, or whatever role they're playing to be successful, we need to create an environment in which they can be successful, which means that we need to promote and train people who have some self-awareness and are able to be good leaders that create a good environment. And that if we are not investing in that, the cost is high because 90% of salespeople are unsatisfied and 70% of those are looking for a new job. And what we know is that the cost of replacing a salesperson, which we tend to do, less than 3 years, like we're constantly turning over our salespeople, we're spending a lot of money and losing the opportunity cost of an untrained salesperson is high. So the cost of not having solid leadership, enlightened leadership, diverse in thinking leadership that creates an environment where salespeople can be successful, that we're costing ourselves as a company a lot of money. Did I just interpret that right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things is also when you're going through this, if you bring on the wrong leader, right? When you're going through this, the competition isn't sitting still waiting for you to figure out your shit, right? They're moving forward. So you're not only losing the internal organization that you've built and possibly good reps and everything else, but your competition is now either catching up or lapping you at that point because of this internal strife, because that's ultimately what's going to end up happening, right? If people are not motivated, I think I've said, like, people will go to work for somebody for a title and they'll do it for a short period of time out of respect for that thing. But ultimately, if you show that you're going to invest in those people, help them grow, help them get to where they want to be, things like that, those people will run through walls for you, right? If you consistently do that and you make them better. But if you're not willing to do that, well, then you're gonna have a pretty rapidly sinking organization over the midterm. I don't think it has to be long-term.
It was interesting. I did the classic, let's ask Gemini Pro, Copilot, everybody else, what are the top 3 things we need to do to motivate sales reps? Because one of the things that's always interesting about these podcasts we do is that you could go and do what I just did. You could go and ask any, AI agent you want to, GPT, etc., and get the answers. What you're hearing here, though, is a lot of wisdom and life experience and anecdotes and stories of lessons learned. So the two come together well. What was interesting was when I asked that question, I had, what are the top 3 things? Number 3, and so this is a little bit for you, Liz, to kind of recap, because you did a great job there. It said I found this ironic. Fostering a positive and supportive culture. Now, the reason I found this ironic was because I asked the question halfway through this discussion. So it wasn't like this answer fed our answer. And they break it down. They say, 1, focus on trust and autonomy. Give your reps a sense of ownership over their work. Number 2, celebrate wins, big and small, publicly acknowledge and celebrate achievements. 3, team building. Encourage collaboration and a sense of community, team mentorship, team activities, best practices. And 4, and I love this one, offer regular constructive feedback. So feedback doesn't have to be a negative, scary process. It can be a constructive process. Go beyond just monitoring quotas, regular one-on-ones, coaching. What are your challenges? Offering guidance. That makes overall that umbrella of a positive and supporting culture. I want to work there. I don't dread getting out of bed and doing this 5 days a week or more. I'm not constantly scanning the LinkedIn, notifications I'm getting of another job for what I do, but another company. This is what makes me want to stay, to the point that Chris was just talking about. This is what makes me loyal. So there you go.
Daryl, I feel like you've sort of teed up. You all know I'm going to pop in with something on culture.
Of course you are. Right? Yeah, baby, go.
I mean, your culture is 100% intrinsically tied to your brand. So I can't not bring that up. But there is a big piece of this. We're talking compensation and we're talking culture. And one of the big missing pieces that I see is a lot of compensation is set from a downstream point of view. What is the KPI we need to hit this quarter or something like that, right? And those are important. Absolutely. We all have goals and we need to hit them. But the piece that's often missing is compensation being tied upstream to your values, to your purpose and values for your company. And it doesn't matter. All of this is about bad alignment in many ways. Like if we're talking about from the CEO to the sales leader to the sales team, to the operations, to the marketing, a lot of this dissolves when you take those numbers, those compensation numbers, and you tie them upstream as much as you do downstream. Because then everybody is rewarded and pointed toward the thing that you have already defined as critical to your culture, which is your purpose and values.
And I cannot wait, because we're going to really dig into that in the next episode. So you just teed that up beautifully, Renee. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up unless we have anything else that we want to drive home. But if we want a successful sales organization, right? Which is when we're talking about compensation, we're talking about motivation. That's what we're talking about. But first, we have to create an environment where they can thrive. And I always say, as a sales leader, or I'll talk to people who do sales enablement, like, what's your first job? Your first job is removing every obstacle to that person doing their job, which is selling. Right? Enable your team to sell if you want them to be motivated and happy to be there. Two, and we didn't talk about this, but just really quickly, you have to have the right people for the job that you have hired in your company. So if you're hiring the wrong people to do the job that you haven't really aligned the skill set and the job, you're going to have a bunch of really unhappy, miserable people who aren't successful. So regardless of how you motivate them, if they don't have the right skill set to do that job and they can't learn it or don't want to learn it, you're not going to have a good environment. So we have to create an environment. We've got to get the right people in there, and we need to, as Mike was talking about, and Bryn, we need to continue to train those people that are in a leadership role to be good leaders. So can we wrap that up here? Is this what we need to do before we can even begin talking about compensation and KPIs?
Yes.
So can I'd love to just add one more thing. So again, and something that Liz and I were talking about, training needs to be focused on the right activities. I know this is going to kind of bridge into KPIs, but there's so much sales training out there that's focusing on the wrong things, that's creating the wrong behaviors. So we have to align what we want to be with what we are teaching out there. And I know that's going to go, I want to be careful I don't jump into KPIs too quickly, but I think just knowing that what leadership is teaching is wrong mostly.
Liz, I'll add one parting thought too, on top of what you were just saying about hiring correctly and training, that all goes together. There's a huge movement right now in human resources to reconfigure how hiring is done. And the chatter at the moment, and the number one thing they're retraining human resources professionals for, is skills-based hiring versus credential-based hiring. So like screening people through the process based on skills. And there's a lot coming out of SHRM, which is the Society of Human Resource Management, about the skills-based hiring. And I think sales is probably one of the top places where skills-based hiring would benefit.
All right. Thanks, Renee. Thanks, everybody, for joining us in this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. If you want a team that is delivering the results that you need them to deliver, you need to create an environment where they can do that. And we're going to talk more about compensation and KPIs and motivating in the next 3 episodes. So join us there, everybody. Have a great day and happy selling. Okay. So let's talk about compensation. Let's talk about bonuses and commissions and those goodies. You ready? And I don't know if we have anybody with us today. If anybody's in the audience, say hello. Let us know you're there. And let's jump in. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm going to stop and start that again and put us like this. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Hyman, your host, and I am here with your Sales SOS podcast crew, Mike Simmons, Renee Bigelow, Chris Bowen, Bryn Tillman, and Daryl Prell. And we are here these 4 episodes really talking about compensating and motivating your sales team to do what you need and want them to do. So in this episode, we're going to be speaking specifically about the compensation piece, about how they get paid, about bonuses and commissions. And I think it's really important. I was at a conference, actually spoke at a conference in April that was a compensation conference. And the questions really were, how do we do this? How do we figure out how to compensate? And I was actually asked to speak about, once you get them compensated, what is all this other stuff you need to do to make sure they're successful? But it's a really tough question. How do you figure out what your compensation structure is going to look like? And what I will tell you is that for a lot of companies, it starts with what can we afford to pay them? Right? Which is important, because if I'm paying my salespeople more than I can afford to pay them and I'm not charging enough to cover that, then I don't have a business. But that's not what the formula should be. So let's talk about this. How do I figure out how I'm going to compensate my sales organization, the individuals that are doing this selling work? Mike, you want to start? It looks
Yeah,
like
so look, I'm staring at Mike, and Mike's got to start this one.
okay. Hang on.
So there's a handful of variables that we need to understand. The first variable is on target earnings. So what is the earning the professional is going to receive at 100% of quota? And that works whether we're talking about customer success holding a quota, account managers holding a quota, account executives holding a quota, any role inside the organization that has a number. What's their on target earning? Then the next thing that you want to understand is how much leverage do you want either side to be responsible for? So in a typical account executive role, I will usually go with a 50-50, 50% base, 50% variable. That those two numbers ultimately equal their on target earnings at 100%. So let's just say it's 100K OTE on target earnings. They have a 50K base, and then they have a 50K variable that they'll receive throughout the process, ideally, of achieving the total number that they need to hit for the year. And for simple math, let's just say $1 million. If we know those variables, total compensation, OTE, this is not fully loaded rate. That's a different thing, and you want to talk with other people around it. But OTE, compensation on target earnings, I want to know what that number is. Then I want to know how much leverage they're going to take on. If the majority of the work that they're doing is what we would typically call non-sales related activity, or things that are not necessarily going to contribute directly to generating money for the business, they might have a variable and base program where 75 to 80% of their compensation is base, and 25 to 20% might be variable. So there's different ways that you can move that around. So those are the numbers that I put in. Now, here's the thing that's really important is on target earnings means they hit 100%. So if you're going to add a bonus on top of it, that's not part of their on target earning number, unless it happens to be that right when they hit the 100%, that bonus gets triggered. So if you know what your OT is, you know what your leverage is, then you can go through and work out the structure of the plan. Helpful?
Yeah. And I just want to say, though, because this is really important, 70% or somewhere between 60 and 70% of American sales professionals will not hit their quota. They will not hit that full compensation package. And
Which is not necessarily a reflection on the sales rep. Often that's a reflection on sales leadership creating unachievable targets, but that's an aside.
no, I don't think it is an aside. Actually, Daryl, I think it's really important. So if you set up your compensation package based on something that isn't realistic, then you're lying to your team, right?
You have what people have referred to in the market, and I think Amy Volas is one of the people who said this probably the first time I heard it. But you have what's called a faux TE. Yeah,
Right.
like so. Like that's not an on target earning number. It's not a realistic on target earning number. Now, in the absence of data, you might have to make some assumptions and some guesses. And for the first couple of years that you're in a role, you're going to be off and you're going to be learning some things. So my view on that is you should heavily slant to the favor of the rep, not the business. Again, heavily slant toward the favor of the rep, not the business. You're the business owner. They're the ones who are buying into being a part of this. Heavily slant toward them and have them break the plan. If you have the data, don't put together crap plans.
Yep.
So let me just hang on one second. I want to bring you both in, but let me just help with this calculation a little bit. So as you're figuring out that that comp plan, you have to be realistic about what one person can actually physically do in the time frame allotted. So if your sales ratios, if your math says that it's 100 conversations to one closed deal, then you can't expect them to close 1,000 deals, because that would be 100,000 conversations. When I'm really being big and exaggerating on this, but you get the idea. You have to know what it takes for that salesperson to do the work to hit their numbers. And if we just pick a number and we're unrealistic about one person is able to do, and what it takes to close a deal, and what one person is able to physically do in that time frame, we're never going to have realistic numbers, and our salespeople are not going to be successful. So we want to be really clear about that. We don't want to stray on either direction. Bryn, were you going to say something?
So I want to talk about forecasting, because I think there's something really broken in the way sales leadership forecasts, and the way, even in our meetings, where are we on this deal? Oh, they pushed it out 30 more days. Who did the IT sign off on this? No, but I have a verbal. Like, there's no really clear forecasting. And I'm not sure I have the answer to it. But one of the things when I'm talking with clients all the time is I hear we're off of forecast. We're not. Go ahead.
So let me help you with this, Bryn. 60% of American sales leaders are not confident of the forecast. 60%. Well, that means,
and I'm seeing even higher. That okay, this is the forecast. By the way, a lot of it is built off of what the board wants the CEO to perform, and what the CEO now wants the CRO to perform, and what the CEO, like, the forecast is not really based in real numbers. It's based on expectation. And that's really broken, because if our forecast is off, any of the KPIs, none of that works. It's all, what did you call it? Faux?
Yeah, Amy Volitz, faux TE, faux, like faux OTE, faux TE. That's her thing. I
think there's faux forecasting.
Well, the job to be done of a comp plan is around behaviors, kind of like what we were talking about before. Like, what do we want to drive? What do we want to incentivize? The job to be done of a forecast is to create relative predictability inside a business, so that you understand which risk you feel comfortable taking on all sides. Like, how many people do we need to have inside the business, and how many people do we need to let go out of the business? Where can we invest different resources? And some people will say the word risk, but don't really know what it means. And I get it. I make the inconceivable joke every time I say stuff like that, but it's kind of like the word empathy. There's people who say these things out loud, but don't really necessarily know what they mean. And then they end up getting applied in different contexts. And so I think it's really important for folks to understand, when we're talking about like that forecast is, there are ways to manage that effectively, that work over and over and over again. And we're getting better at it, getting better at the ability to analyze data to support more accurate forecasts. As you start to move out, it's much harder to forecast. Just like forecasting the weather 90 days from today is very different than forecasting the weather tomorrow or even in the next hour. So the forecast piece and the compensation piece is are separate pieces, but both equally important inside the business. And I think Liz, we've threatened to have discussions around getting into forecasting and sales process and all of that kind of stuff on one of these things. I don't remember if we've got one scheduled at some point in the future. But I think those things are really hard to combine: forecast and OTE, or forecast and compensation plans.
So I think let's just clarify some vocabulary here.
Yeah.
So first, we have our revenue goal, right? That is what the company decides we are going to try to achieve, based either on a WAG, just a wild guess, or whether we're basing it on a 10% increase over last year, or whether we're basing it on some research that leads us to believe that we are going to hit that number. So that is the first thing. That's our revenue goal. The second thing is quotas. So what we tend to do, again, whether realistic or not, is take that revenue goal and divide it up often evenly between all the sales reps, or we use some mechanism to divide it up among the sales reps, and we call that a quota, right? So you have your revenue goal, you have the individual sales quotas. Now we have what we call a forecast. So a forecast, in some people's mind, is we have a revenue goal of $70 million. Therefore, our forecast is $70 million. That is, in fact, not what a forecast is, right? So your forecast is based upon the number of leads in the funnel, the validity of the leads in the funnel, our sales cycle, the velocity, that they flow through the funnel, all of these things that are happening in the seller's environment that tells us it looks like we're not going to hit our goal this quarter. What we're actually forecasting we will hit is this, or hey, we're going to exceed our goal. We're forecasting that we'll exceed our goal. So we want to really think about these things, because I think we mix these words all up. And a forecast should be, if we have our CRM set up properly and we know how to read it and we understand the math, even though some people say the math, you can change the math, you can't. Your math is your math. You can get better at it. But if it's 10-1, then if you only have 10 things in your funnel, you're only going to close one thing. And I don't care, what you want the forecast to say. It will show you what's actually going to happen. And one more thing about forecast. So we can forecast two different things. We can forecast what deals we think are going to close. We can also forecast our revenue on those closed deals, because for many companies, it comes in over a period of time. And that is a different kind of forecast. So anyway, just make sure we're all speaking the same language.
And one more thing to add, like sometimes people will talk about revenue and what they're talking about is sales. And sometimes, so those get confused too.
Well, no, finish that. What's the other? What else could you mean when you say revenue?
So I'm not a finance. I am not a CFO. I do not have a finance background. But I shouldn't even talk about the difference between revenue and sales. But revenue, I'll leave that to somebody else. Who else wants to talk about what revenue is versus sales? For me is bookings. Revenue is when it's recognized, but go ahead.
I just got schooled on that. I would say that's the easiest explanation, because I'm working with a company who is in the supply chain, and there are returns, or there are damaged goods, or there are whatever. So there's what you've sold, and there's what can be invoiced, and is recognized revenue. So in some companies, those are pretty much one and the same, but in many companies, they are not.
And it's beautiful, because sales can be a leading indicator for revenue. And if you have those numbers, now you can have more predictability relative to revenue that's going to be recognized based on the success that you've had from a sales perspective. And the demand gen stuff can be a leading indicator. Pipeline created, demand gen behind that can be a leading indicator relative to sales. And you start to get these indicators that are out there, which I know we're going to get into KPIs a little bit later. But you get these indicators that start to demonstrate where the health is in the business and where the potential risk is, so that as leaders, we can make better decisions around where do we allocate time, energy, and resource.
Okay, so let's stop for a second. So we've got all this vocabulary. Hang on a second, Bryn. What we really want to talk about is, if this is true, what are we compensating our salesperson on? Are we compensating them on the deal that they sold? Are we or on the revenue, on the dollar amount? Are we compensating them on the profit, the gross profit? Are we compensating them on the net profit? And I will tell you.
So can I just quickly say, just for clarity, sales is what you sold, revenue is what you earned, right? So the question is, a salesperson is only responsible for the sale, unless they sell poorly, and that's why they get chargebacks or other things. But generally, a salesperson is responsible for the sale. The operations and others are more responsible for what you keep, right? Like in a big picture. So when you build out compensation, obviously you can't pay out more than you keep, but there has to be a fairness for the sales rep, since they can only control what they can control. That's all.
Some businesses,
Wait.
businesses though will pay on revenue just because that's the operating model that they use. And there's certain businesses that will do it, and there are others that will pay on sales. And I mean, there's other ones that will pay on bookings. Like I was fortunate enough to work inside an organization when you get paid up front on a 3-year contract.
Wow.
Like that was pretty cool. It was short lived. It wasn't. It was early on in a different place. But like there are just different. There are so many different ways. I think the key takeaway for me, or where my brain's going on this, is be super clear about what your definitions are. Make sure that you're aligned across the team around what those definitions are. And we've talked about in the past the role reflective model. What is it? Definition. So what? Why does it matter? Now what? What are we going to do with the data? What are we going to do with the information? Apply that in any of these things. You'll start to figure out what makes sense for you and your business, because operating your business based on profit in one market might make sense. Operating it based on top line sales in another market might make more sense. Operating it some other way, based on activity might make sense in another place, but I don't want to be a part of that place.
Daryl, did you have something to say? Wait. Okay, go ahead, Renee.
I was just saying what you're saying, without saying, but I'll make it a little bit more explicit, is that each of these different ways of compensation is essentially a strategic lever, right?
Right.
Like, so if you need to scale quickly, you want more sales right away. You worry about profitability later. If you are in a very thin margin company, then you're much more concerned about profitability, right? Each one of these is a strategic lever, and there are different times in the ebb and flow, even within a business, where those things change. So you may have an expansion project or new product where you are going to compensate differently than you do on your core business. And if you look at each of those things in the compensation plan for our sales as a strategic lever and how you want to use it strategically. So I think your point of defining it clearly is incredibly important, so that the salesperson is like, wait, I don't understand. I sold this. Why am I only compensating on this? Right? Like, so that is not sour grapes. That is clearly understood going in. Right. But then that you are also explaining why, right? Like, so if you have a business expansion and you are going to compensate on sales, not revenue, because we know there's a lot to be worked out, and we know that the operations side is going to be kind of messy, but we really need to see the viability of the market, so we want to get out there and do sales. Then you need to be very clear. We're testing this out. We know this is new. This is what it is right now, because you're likely going to change it at some point, and you need to be very clear, because otherwise it's going to end up in that sour grapes category again with, like, I don't understand. When I sold it for this, I used to make X. Now I make Y. I'm not going to sell it anymore. Right. So I think really thinking about it, like Mike said, defining clearly, using it as a strategic lever, and then communicating why you're using it as a strategic lever.
And
Okay,
I would follow up with that.
Wait, Chris, go ahead. Start.
Sorry. One quick thing is, because that plan is going to change at some point in the future, be really, really clear about why you're changing it and the elements that you're changing. Because if you leave it, if they go in with this understanding that you had up front, and then it changes, maybe the business is a monumental success, and now we have to adjust some things because we're doing so much better than what we thought. But that also has meant the overall business has grown. Our overall overhead has exploded and things like that we now have to take care of. Make sure you're really clear about why you're doing it and how that's going to impact those particular people. At least that's how I tend to view those things.
Okay, so
there's one thing we haven't talked about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is, but we've talked around it. We've talked about forecasting. We've talked about revenues. We've talked about comp plans. We've talked about activities, and it's got to be rational and reasonable. We've talked about closing rates, say 10-1, right, and pipeline, and everything else. Here's the thing. Liz briefly talked about, kind of a top down. What's the number? And we got to work backwards. In other words, the company's sales revenue number we want to achieve for the year. Here's the thing you got to be careful of, guys, when you're doing compensation planning. There's going to be a tendency by the investors, by the board, possibly by a founder/CEO, to blindly say, this is the number we want for next year. And it's going to be, like Mike's already laughing. It is a big ass hairy number. All right. And the CEO, especially the founders, have zero experience doing this before. And they're going to go, okay, because they're feeling captive to these investors. They don't want the investors to leave. So they're going to say, okay. And then they're going to come back and they're going to say, but sales reps make too much money and we have a hiring freeze on because we actually want to be profitable because that's where we get our valuation up. So no more hiring additional staff. And then someone's going to go back there and say, okay, so if we want to double our revenue, because those are the stupid ass things people come up with, but we're going to have
10 times. We're going to 10 times. That's my favorite. We're going to 10 times revenue.
10 times revenue, 10x, same amount of staff. They're just going to say, okay, so your comp plan went from being, I'll use Mike's numbers, your OTE is still 100,000 a year, and it's still 50-50, but going back to Liz's numbers, instead of you making 1,000 calls, we 10x'd it. So now you have to make 10,000 calls. All right. Okay, that's probably not realistic. So you do, instead of 1,000 calls, do 3,000 calls, and instead of closing 1 in 10, you'll close 1 in 3. But we'll do nothing to change the training, and there'll be no other indicators of that this is even achievable. Which, by the way, leads to our last conversation, that now you're creating a culture in your organization of frustration and anger and annoyance and everything else, and they're all going to bail. In other words, you can't go top down. You got to fight that urge to appease these mystical people who are up in the heavens. You have to kind of do the forecasting thing and go, what is achievable? If this is the salaries we're going to pay, and this is the max, this is the quality of people I can attract on that, this is the activity we can do. I can maybe, if I'm really kick ass, I can maybe improve our sales success by 10 or 20% this year, maybe, if I hire Mike to come in and teach all my crew. All right. But that's it. In other words, you've got to use realistic numbers, because if you don't, there will be a shit show in your organization. You're going to miss your numbers, and you're going to take years to recover. And that's where sales leadership and the executives need to bump heads in private to have that conversation. And that's your job as a sales leader.
So let's talk for a second before we wrap this up. There's a saying in the world of sales, which is salespeople do what they're compensated to do.
Yes.
Right. So if that's the case, and as Renee said, these are levers. These are levers. Compensation is a lever. If I want my sales team to sell this product as opposed to that one because this one's more profitable, I need to incent them to do it and make it easy for them to do it. If I want them to go after new business and not focus on repeat business, then I need to incent them to do that. And more importantly, we forget that if you want them to do the work to grow an existing account, which is a lot of work, people think, oh, it's an existing account, just re-sign it. If I want them to focus on that, then I need to incent them, and they will focus on what they're incented to do, unless the path to get to that compensation is so difficult that they know they're not going to get it anyway. So then they're going to sell what's easiest because at least I get something. So when we're building the comp plan, one, it needs to be simple, right? I mean, we all agreed to that. That's what we were saying earlier, right? If I think I'm going to get this and then I get this and I don't understand and when does it come, you're going to have unhappy salespeople and they're going to leave. So it needs to be simple, easy to understand, easy to implement. Everybody in the company needs to be, from accounting to the CFO, to the salesperson, to the sales lead, everybody needs to be able to understand it. Second, it needs to incent your team to do what you want them to do. If you want them to be team players, then you have to build the compensation such that they are team players. If you want them to just get revenue, regardless of what happens, what wreckage is left behind them, then compensate them that way. I think the third thing is we tend to think that, oh, that salesperson's making too much money. I'm going to change their compensation plan so they make less money. They will leave and make more money for someone else who compensates them to do it. So this idea that my salespeople make too much money only matters if you haven't built a compensation plan that covers your cost of doing business. So it's really important when we design this compensation plan that we think through the results that we want and inputs that are required to get that. Is there any, I think I wrapped it up, but is there anything else on that?
here's a simple way to cover the whole my sales rep makes too much money. And it built on Liz's point. When you understand your metrics, like what your cost of sale metrics are specifically from a sales rep compensation perspective, maybe because of the way that you're operating as a business, you allocate the 14%, that's what your number ends up being. At the top end of the comp plan for the individual rep, when they break the comp plan and they blow through their number, cap that at 14% commission with no cap on the total amount of commission. This way, when you go back in and do the math on those extra dollars that are generated, or pounds or whatever, wherever you're located, then you can go through and say, yes, they were highly compensated. This is what they contributed. And for every dollar above and beyond the 100% or wherever it is, this is what their cost of sale was relative to that. So it's just a simple way to do it. Here's the problem. Most early career sales leaders look at their CFO as an adversary. They look at them as the problem. They look at them as the person who's always questioning why the comp plan works this way and all that other kind of stuff. Stop. Look at them as an advocate. Look at them as a partner. Get an understanding of how the business operates. And then from there, go in and do your job and start designing things to align within the business parameters like Liz was talking about.
Liz, can I share a quick story about this too much compensation? One of my first jobs at a mega corporation, or probably my first job at a huge mega corporation, if I remember correctly, our corporate board in New York decided these few people at one division, right, were out making more than many executives. And they decide they want to cap compensation, right? Let me tell you what immediately happened. This company, who was ranking very highly in their competitive set, started falling. And worse than that, because each time they capped a salesperson who was that successful, they left. Exactly what you said, but it's worse. Not only did they leave, they went out and they didn't just take a list and go to a competitor, which I think is what these executives, as Daryl said, sitting up in the heavens or whatever, were thinking. Oh, well, they just won't go down the street to the competitor, blah, 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 whatever. No, they created their own business and became an in-between step between the competitor and their former company with those group of customers. And now they were a number one customer, ability to be a number one customer with all that buying power of their former clients, and could put it wherever they wanted. Do you think they put a ton with the company that just capped them? Or do you think that they put it elsewhere in the market, right? So it was like a dual. Not only did they lose their top sellers, couldn't make that up, then they started losing out of retribution because the seller was still close to and performing well for the customers, and they wanted to continue working for them. So when they put themselves in between the company and the customer, they still won. So I just have to say it, because unless you experience the pain, you may not understand what we're talking about. And there is often pain. I mean, I am very comfortable going into if I work as a CMO, VP of marketing, whatever, I'm very comfortable walking around in a sales meeting and knowing there are people in there making more than me. It's not, I don't have the ego with it. So what? I took a job for whatever I took a job for. It has nothing to do with them, right? So I just had to say that because I think too many people don't think through the pain that comes with it.
I think also people forget about the risk that salespeople, that is inherent in a sales role, unless you're paid without commission, unless you're just paid. So as we're building that commission package, we have to remember that, or that compensation package, that they have to pay the bills in addition to, being able to make extra bonus or extra money. They've got to make enough to pay the bills, or they're not going to stay with you.
And all of this self-awareness you're just talking about, Liz, and Renee and everybody else, goes back to everything we just talked about in the previous episode. All right? That's the foundation. You need proof of it? Here you go.
Okay, so hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of your Sales SOS podcast as we were talking about compensation and bonuses. Well, we didn't get into the nitty gritty of exactly how you do it. You now have some of the key indicators or key factors that will impact the way you make those decisions. Okay, let's do the next one. KPIs that drive accountability and performance. Are we ready for that one? Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Hyman, your host, and I am here with your Sales SOS podcast crew: Daryl Prell, Bryn Tillman, Chris Bowen, Renee Bigelow, and Mike Simmons. And we're talking about motivating salespeople. And in the last episode, we were talking about compensation. This episode, we're going to talk more about KPIs and accountability. And I think this is a super important topic, in part because I think everybody who's sitting here with me will say people often measure the wrong things. So when you're thinking about KPIs are part of driving behavior. So if we want our salespeople to accomplish certain things, we want to drive certain behaviors, we set KPIs around it. We have to remember that we're always going to balance a bunch of things. So there's their compensation plan and their KPIs. If their KPIs and their compensation plan don't align, guess what? They're going to focus on their compensation plan and they're not going to care about your KPIs because all they care about is how they're compensated. Uh, and what we spoke about a couple of episodes ago was this idea of creating an environment where they can be successful. So again, they're not going to care about your KPIs if they're in an environment where they can't be successful. So all of these things go together as we're talking about KPIs, but let's think about KPIs and accountability. What should we be measuring? What matters? Go ahead, Bren.
So I think you have to start with the end in mind with what matters, right? Like and then we have to look at, is every KPI that I'm managing working toward or against that goal, right? So for example, the number one KPI that we measure is how many conversations with the right people are generated from LinkedIn or Sales Navigator, right? So if that is the ultimate KPI, I'm not going to measure how many likes did I get on a post, because that is not working toward necessarily a direct connection. But what might? That I have new connections that meet my ICP, and that that they responded to a message, and that they found value, that I've sent them value and they reacted, and then they converted to a conversation. I mean, that's a very general thing, but there are so many KPIs that we could measure that don't equal that conversation. So really, I don't have a ton of input on KPIs because I really only focus on this very narrow area. But the biggest mistake I see are we're measuring KPIs that don't necessarily lead to the solution or the success metrics that we want to measure. And so the number one thing we have to do is begin with the end in mind. We can't have KPIs in the beginning of the sales process until we know what the end looks like and we back into it. So that's my only input for KPIs.
Chris, what do you have for us on KPIs?
Well, I mean, I agree with Bren that you have to start with the end in mind. I think just do you understand how that actually works and how you get to a deal. A lot of times you have people that put this in number from a revenue perspective or total contract value or whatever it happens to be. But what's the process to be able to get there? How long is that going to take? Depending on the type of market you're selling in, those things could happen really fast, or they could also happen really, really slow, right? Like deals that take multiple years in order to close. So you have to be able to figure out what's your actual process. And then let's say I have a friend of mine who does big industrial sales. Those deals will take 2.5 to 3 years for what they're selling. Well, that seller probably understands that, but is your compensation structure set up in a way that you recognize those interim milestones that are going to get you to that deal? And how do you recognize that? It's obviously not going to be compensated at the full price of a deal, but are you rewarding that progress in the right ways? So I think you have to be able to understand your process and then map the compensation to what you're looking for. I mean, the easy ones are going to be your revenue numbers, could be margin if there's a portion of that really impacts your business, things like that. But that's where I think you have to be able to really understand it and then drive compensation from there.
So, and I don't know that everybody who's sitting here will agree with me, but I like to tie KPIs for salespeople to their funnel. You guys have all heard me talk about funnel, right? I talk about funnel instead of pipeline. It comes out of my Miller Hyman days, and I'm a daddy's girl, I guess, because I still talk about a funnel. That the idea being that it's wider on the top and narrower at the bottom, and that there are certain ratios that you need to keep in order to hit your sales goals. So I made a joke about it. If it's 1,000 to 1, then I need to have 1,000 things in the top of my funnel if I'm going to get one thing out the bottom. And while I'm not a big fan of how many phone calls did you make, make 900 phone calls, and I don't care what else you do. I do care that we're making progress, that there's progression through the sales process, and that we're measuring it. So if something comes out the bottom of the funnel and my sales ratio is 10 conversations to 1 closed deal, then I need to make sure that there's 10 things coming into the top. If I have to close 1 deal a day, that there's 10 things coming into the top of the funnel, but that also they're converting to a certain number are converting to qualified, and a certain number are converting to solving or cultivating, or whatever I want to call that state, so that somebody's watching the actual ratios required to hit numbers. Now, yes, some people will be better than others. Some people will take 3 phone calls to close 1 deal, and some people will take 100. But you have to know what that math is, or have some sense of that math and velocity, and then you need to make sure that they're doing that. So I like to set KPIs around that, just because it forces the conversation. And I don't know what you guys think about that.
Well, I think what you're hitting at, and I really like where you're going, is so correct me if I'm misconstruing what you're saying, is you're identifying, shall we say, the best practices of, shall we say, the top performers ish in your market for what you sell. So in your example, you could argue that 10 conversations results in 1 deal. I would even go one step further, say 10 conversations over what time frame. And then you'd be measuring that, and it would be on a dashboard, and it'd be something that, as a coaching process, I can say, listen, you've only had 3 conversations with this prospect over the last 6 weeks. Why is that? What's the holdup, right? So you're right, it's not the number of dials, but it is a metric that we've correlated back to top performing reps. And we have seen, when we focus on those metrics, a market improvement in our success rate. So I 1,000% agree with that. And the problem is, too many sales leaders just fall on the classics. Like, I don't want to do that analysis of what those top performing metrics are. I just want to focus on dials, right? Or conversations. And that, I can work if I'm selling a pen maybe, but other than that, every industry is a little different, a little more unique. And you have to actually invest the time to figure that out. And I find too many leaders don't have the patience or the intelligence to do that. Boy, I'm going to get nailed for saying that.
I think it's also, I think when you look at just like counting metrics, like dials or whatever, like there's plenty of ways for that data to be, I'll say inaccurate is probably the nicest way to put it. If you only focus on counting metrics, and you're really, really hardcore about it, you'll get compliance, but you're probably not going to get the results that you're looking for, or that you think you're going to deliver.
So what would you measure then?
No, I mean, I think I would still measure some of those items, because I want to understand, because I think there's an axis of some level of activity mixed with a level of competence in your ability to deliver that message and understand the sales process and be able to help move a customer through the mixture of your process and their process, right? I think there's really, really important pieces there. So if you have zero activity, I can tell you what your number is going to be, right?
Right.
So there has to be a portion of it that you're looking at to understand what are they doing from an outreach perspective? What are they doing to help drive those conversations? How are they progressing that to the next conversation? Have they thought about other ways of short-circuiting pieces of that? If you know that, hey, if we're going to get to a point of doing a deal, I have to have an NDA or an MSA in place. Well, do I understand what their process is for that? Because I may be convincing the buyer, hey, we're ready to go. Well, then vendor management or procurement's going to get involved. And now I found out that it's going to be another 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever that time frame is. So there's lots of little things that I can do to be able to measure how I'm doing it. So in new logos, I always look for then MSAs, things like that. Have we gotten agreement to go forward? Because that indicates a different level of interest on the customer perspective, especially in large customers, because those things take time.
So if you have a business-to-business complex sale, one of the KPIs you might want to put in place is how many of the buyers have you spoken to at what point in the sales process. So the best way to lose a deal and be surprised by it is to only speak with one buyer. You guys
yes,
have all heard me call it my guys.
Single threading will kill you.
Single threading in a complex business.
Shout it from the rooftops, Liz, because I'm blown away by how many reps refuse to do that. They just find that internal champion and they hold on to them for all dear life. Stupid. I'm sorry.
Absolutely agree. It's bad business, man. Like if you don't have multiple contact points, you actually can't triangulate. Are you getting the full message out of that account? You're getting it from one person's perspective. You don't know what the competing priorities are in a lot of those cases. And so having those multiple touch points, having those multiple people, and then when you look at buying committees and what they've gone from 11 to 17 over the past 5 years, if you only have one of those 17, you better hope it's the right one.
I will add in, because I've worked with 2 clients in the past 3 years who had a very their customer base had an extremely high attrition rate for their contact. So 30 to 40% turnover in their customer base every year. And so one of the things that I came in to do for both of them is figure out how to deepen the relationship so that critical failure point doesn't happen as much. And this doesn't have to do with not closing, right? This is they're successfully closing, but it doesn't matter in a few months because that person's gone and then they have to start all over, right? So definitely deepening. But in one of them, we even found a way to turn that into like some flywheel growth, right? Like if those people are leaving and they're going elsewhere, how can we convert them? And if they're staying within an industry that we can still address, how can we convert that into something? So that idea of the critical failure point, I think, is the way that you have to, again, I'm a marketer, you have to bring up the pain, right? So if we say, you shouldn't just be talking to one person, look at it this way. How many people, if we only have a relationship with that one person, how many people are going to leave before the sale gets done, during the negotiations, or after the sale before adoption can hit and before it spreads through where it's supposed to? So it's a critical risk, in my opinion, beyond just the sale.
So quickly, Renee, before I move you off, I want to talk about if you have an account-based approach and you have sales and marketing working together, and account-based lead gen is what I call it, as opposed to account-based marketing. What kind of KPIs can you set around that? And before I let you say that, I just want to say one thing about those single buyer, and that is I want to have a curse jar in every sales meeting that is actually for when you say, I'm talking to the decision maker, then you have to put $20 in the jar. But Renee,
Well,
so
at least then you'll have your own piggy bank for when you lose a sale.
that's what I need. Okay, so Renee, if you're doing this account-based approach to lead generation, that's sales and marketing, what are some of the KPIs you would put around that to keep both teams engaged and working together?
I don't know that I have the exact answer that you're going for, but I think I have sort of an umbrella statement above it, which is I always think it's important to have, whether you do it in a bonus structure or you do it in compensation or goals, is you need to have some that are group based instead of individual based, because you always have some sort of, not always, 90% of the time when you go into companies, there will be some sort of misalignment around sales and marketing, even if it's at the individual level. So you have to find a way to bind those two things together. But worse than that, I would say, and many of the positives of how salespeople operate as like these entrepreneurs inside of companies, and they truly are. They're also highly competitive, which means they win a lot, right? Those are the positives. The negatives of being highly competitive is that sometimes we don't have cooperative work and we don't have team exercises. And when we're doing these account-based marketing, we're going to come up with situations where two sales reps are going to be touching maybe one division of one company and one division of another company. Now all of a sudden one's going to get it versus the other. Like, and then you have the marketers involved trying to do the lead gen. Like it just gets really messy. And if it's very competitive and there isn't a team goal in some form or fashion, then everybody kind of loses. The biggest loser is the company, right? Because everybody kind of walks away because they don't want to share or whatever. So I don't have an exact KPI for you because my mind's just not going there on the spot. But I can tell you, I think that overarching part is incredibly important. It might be controversial for some because a lot of people want to say, no, I want to pay people for what they do, what they specifically do, and I want them doing their job. But their job is also part of working for the company. So some companies will set that into the base pay, right? That these are the things that you must do in order to have your job, and it's attributed into the base pay. And some people will put it into commission, and some people will put it into bonus pools. But I think it's incredibly important that it is spelled out and set with an expectation that it happens. I'll let someone else contribute here.
Mike, you've been quiet. Do you have something to add?
Yeah. So the way that might help some people think about this is, what's your primary KPI for the area of the business you're operating in? What are you ultimately measured on? How do you know if you're winning or losing or successful or not in that functional area based on the job? And then what's the KPI that you would use to indicate a handoff between that function and the next function, or that team and the next team, or the previous team and the next team, however you think about it? And just so you could go, if you write on a piece of paper, you take a piece of paper out right in front of you, just write KPI for marketing, whatever that is, then put a line next to it, and then write KPI for sales, whatever that is, and then do a KPI on top of the line. And now you've got three numbers that'll help bridge the gap between those two areas. And what you're thinking about is conversion metrics from one group to another, similar to what Liz was talking about in conversion metrics from sales stage standpoint, to help demonstrate that people are moving through the funnel. And for me, on the sales side, the two KPIs I care about, and I used to care about more way back when, but the two that I care about most are pipeline created, or opportunities created that go in the top of the funnel. So pipeline created, and then pipeline developed. How did everything develop through the funnel or the pipeline at each of those stages, and ultimately move to closed won? So, and then once you have your conversion metrics there, you can go through and start to get really good at forecasting if you've got the right definitions in place that you agree to across the teams from a stage standpoint. But simple as possible on the KPIs, ideally one KPI for each group that demonstrates whether or not that group is successful. And then one KPI that is shared, like Renee was talking about, that shows the conversion that happened from one to another. And if you think about it, many of your leading indicators in the business are actually lagging indicators for that next stage. So know what the difference is between a leading and a lagging indicator as you break this down.
Renee, you got
Said real
something?
quick,
Yeah.
in the first a couple episodes ago, when we started talking about compensation, I talked about aligning values to compensation. And if you were to go look at almost any company's values, there's going to be something about cooperation, team, collective, something like that. And yet, if you look inside the compensation of most companies, that is not reflected in any way. Like, is there anything in our compensation that supports this value?
Oh, I agree.
So one of the things I've seen in the past is having a tied to a deal that does not impact the rep's compensation, but is a discretionary pool that allows you to name the people that you think should be compensated on a particular deal. We also have I've seen other structures where, based on, and this is more for like large deal teams, there's a discretionary pool related to the role that you played on that particular team or the number of people that played a particular role. So if I needed 6 different SMEs from different pieces of the business, and this deal is going to go through, they're all going to ultimately get a portion of that, right? So being able to think it through and say, hey, what is our sales motion and how do we manage that, I think is important. And we all say that sales is a team sport. There's a portion of that you should probably adhere to, but like I said, they don't necessarily have the same types of risks as a seller. So that's the other half of that. So that's why I think that discretionary pool is a little bit smaller, but impactful nonetheless.
Hey, Liz, just one other thing to add to what Renee shared on the account-based marketing piece, and with the confusion that can get created in teams. If you are doing account-based marketing and you have global accounts that you're targeting, and you have people with territories based on geography, you are creating more tension and more problems inside your business than is necessary. And those problems will ultimately turn into your customers' problems. So if you're taking an account-based marketing approach for the teams that are involved in those type of accounts, take a named account structure and apply it to the way that you carve out or create territories for those teams. Named account structure aligned with account-based marketing can create amazing opportunities for teams to come together and grow business. Account-based marketing with geography-based territories, you're just going to have a lot of infighting and people complaining about how they talked to so-and-so and so-and-so did whatever. So just something to think about on the account-based marketing and target accounts perspective in sales and marketing alignment.
Liz, this is probably a good topic for another time, but what Daryl just pointed out exacerbates even further, and I would say it's more detrimental to business growth, and that is when this extends across in partnership deals, when there's partnership marketing. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been in very promising conversations with big deals that completely blow up because no one can agree, even at the executive level, how they're going to split a commission. Right? Like, I don't know if y'all have had this happen, but I
can tell you what the split on zero is.
You can't just make a decision of how we're going to say this is going to be commissioned, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us for this episode of your Sales SOS podcast. I think sales compensation and motivation are super important topics because, one, people aren't sure how to do it, and two, it changes your outcomes dramatically. So in our next episode, we're going to talk about motivation from a sales coaching perspective and motivation as opposed to using KPIs or compensation packages. So join us in that next episode. Okay, you guys ready?
Yep,
I
I'm
just
gonna
have
drop.
to say real quick, Daryl, your dog signaled to my dog, so after your dog made the noise, my dog came running.
That's hysterical.
Stupid ass dog.
All right. Bye, Chris. All right. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm your host, Liz Hyman, and I am here with your Sales SOS podcast crew, Daryl Prell, Renee Bigelow, and Mike Simmons. And today we're talking about compensating and motivating sales teams. And in this episode, we've had a couple episodes talking about this, but in this specific episode, we're going to talk about coaching and motivating, what we as sales leaders can do to help motivate. That is aside from just this is how you're going to be compensated and this is how you're going to be measured. What are the other things that we can do to get our sales teams to perform the way we want? And I will say before we start that depending upon who you read, a sales leader or sales manager's job, 30% to 70% of the time, you should be coaching. Now, if you're the CEO and the sales leader, chances are you're probably not accomplishing 70% of your time coaching. But whatever measure we use, a lot of your time should be involved in coaching your sales organization, your individual players. So what have you guys, what are your thoughts on coaching and motivating your salespeople?
I think we should just yell at them. That's been and it works pretty. Sorry.
I think it's extremely effective. I've seen it work over and over again.
Over and over again. Yeah, it really gets the results. Yeah. It works well on my spouse too, just so you know.
When all else fails, say it louder.
Exactly.
Very motivating.
There's one I want to share because it really stands out to me, and it has always stood out to me because I've never agreed with the sandwich ratio. Say one good thing, say one bad thing, say one good thing, right? Like it's so transparent what you're doing. Frances Fry, who's a Harvard Business School professor, I met several years ago, and she has done a ton of research around this and says it really needs to be, in this like 20-to-1 ratio in order to keep employees engaged. And this is where she spends an abnormal amount of her time and is fantastic. I highly recommend that you follow her. But she recommends a 10-to-1 and that you start with a 5-to-1 because everybody's so woefully behind that a 5-to-1 is very hard to achieve, right? That you can't throw people into a 10-to-1. So like if you're talking about motivation, you're going to have to, I think in sales in particular, you're going to be coaching them to do something differently. You're going to be giving feedback. They're getting lots of no's. They're like, it's an area, this is going to come up. So you got to build that bank up, I think, as much as possible. And I think sales is probably one of those areas where you should really, really work towards 10-to-1 rather than even her suggested starting a 5-to-1.
10-to-1 meaning 10 good things for every negative thing.
I like to say catch people doing good, right? And not only that, but when you do it, you set examples for everybody else. If you realize that there's a lot of competitive nature inside of sales teams, which is very good, you can activate that competitive nature by catching people doing good. They want to be caught doing good, right? They want to be recognized as well. So publicly, not just one-on-ones, that 10-to-1.
I had a golf coach, which would imply that I got to be a good golfer, which I never did. But I had a golf coach that I would say, what am I doing wrong? And he'd say, let's wait until you're doing something right. And then I'll tell you. Like, let's focus on what you're doing right, not on what you're doing wrong.
And so you were doing everything wrong. That's what I take away from it.
I think that's what he was implying. And,
he tried.
Exactly.
Right. But I think that there's something to be said for that. We know when we've done something wrong most of the time, and we don't need to be told that we're doing it wrong. We need help figuring out how to do it right. And so how do you have those conversations with salespeople around how do we do this right? I think several episodes ago, I said something about doing something fun, and something fun would be doing like an account review or brainstorming about ideas to do things differently. And you guys like, well, that just sounds terrible. And that's what we think because most of our coaching conversations are negative coaching conversations, right? Okay, you're not doing this right. You could be doing this. You should be doing this. Next time, do this. And that is not coaching. That may be managing, but it's not coaching. And when we're coaching, what we're doing is helping the team identify what they could be doing better and helping them formulate the solution to doing it better. So if we're telling them what they're doing wrong and we're telling them what they should do next, they're neither learning nor are they feeling good, nor are they owning anything successful. Right? So if we're going to coach to success, we need to coach in a way that builds, not in a way that tears down.
So I love what you're saying. I'll say it just a little bit different. And that is, I have to create, even talking about the way that builds, to me, that looks like that you're creating an environment of trust. In other words, for me to eventually hear from you, my boss, what you think I'm doing less than optimal. How's that? Or for me to have I guess the feeling of safety enough to admit, proactively say, listen, I'm really struggling here, or I haven't been able to do that there. There has to be a feeling of trust. If I think I'm going to share something with you and then you're going to use it, and I worry you're going to use it to pit me, 2 weeks later, I'm never going to share. I'm never going to give you that. Right. So if you, as my boss, have a history of just attacking or just being type A driven and lacking any empathy or lacking any coaching skills or being unable to walk alongside me or only assume that your way is the right way, and therefore if I do it slightly different, even if I'm having success, it's wrong, I don't trust you. I won't hear anything you say, and I will become a yes man. I will tell you what you want to hear, and then I'll go do it my own way again. I'm gonna actively avoid your advice. So you talk about the build up. To me, that's establishing trust, which means as a leader, you need to spend that first month, 2, 3, whatever it takes, building that safe environment with that new rep before you start just tearing them down and ripping them up. Right? That's what that means. But that's my experience. Mike, you're the pro here on this one. Am I out to lunch, or do you have better advice?
I think the big question. So I don't know. The big question. I don't know if you're out to lunch or if you're on point or either one of those.
Okay.
The bigger question here is like, what is a coach? Like, what is a coach? So Daryl is in, to me, what looks like a big motor coach.
Yes.
I think like you're in a cabin kind of area, kind of place. Yes. You got a ceiling fan. So I don't know if that thing actually has wheels or not, but you're out in this environment. You, if you go back in time and you think about what a coach did, a coach was a vehicle that would help people get, or a person get from A to B, from one place to another. So we as coaches help people get from where they are to where they could potentially be. And their view of what the future might be may be slightly different than yours. So that might be misaligned. And sometimes you see more for them and sometimes they see more in themselves. But if a coach's objective is to help someone get from A to B, let's first understand what A is and where B is, and then put the things in place to help support it. I don't think that coaches really need to be liked. And the reason why I don't think coaches need to be liked, other than I think we've gone a bit too far with these participation trophies out there, is the coach objective is get from A to B. If both of us are aligned on getting from both A to B, and the coach can do the job helping the person see different, move their feet on a pedal, or move their feet properly when they're skating, or work on hand position when stick handling, like all of these things, they can start to see things that the person doesn't see themselves because they're so deep into the challenge that I did that for you, Daryl, the hockey stuff. So that because they're so into the challenge that they can't see beyond their skis or where they're at. So let's first define what a coach is, and then let's also work through the process of saying what's the objective of the coaching, and then let's go through and say, do we agree? Are we aligned on that objective? Because if you're not aligned on that objective, I don't care what kind of coach you are or what kind of coaching you provide, you're not going to help somebody get from A to B if your B is different than their B, or their A is different than their A, or somebody else's yeah, has a different perspective in there.
So the one thing I love what you're saying, it's getting alignment on, where we are and where we want to go. I'll go back to what I was saying on the trust thing, only just because it's contextual to what Mike is saying, is you can get that alignment. But if the sales rep has got some legacy baggage, a bad boss, a bad past coach, then that's where the trust comes in. And so you just need to be self-aware as the coach that when you hire that rep, you're hiring all the bad and the good of their previous career. And that's going to be part of your challenge to deal with or to exploit. It could be a good thing.
Think about how hard communication is when you're communicating with someone who has all of this kind of technical or organization or relationship debt, like your dog getting snapped at every once in a while. Like at some point, that dog is just going to start shaking and quivering over in the corner, learned helplessness. But if they get through this period where they've had to deal with this fog or this veil of, every time I've shared, I've gotten it, it comes back out, comes back up and gets me. Then you've got a lot of relationship stuff to overcome. And to build on Daryl's point, it goes far beyond the people that they've worked with. Think about where they were raised, what their family life was like, how, like all of that kind of stuff. Like there's so much baggage. And many of us really struggle with being open and honest, that self-awareness piece that we talked about in the first piece, being open and honest around what our strengths are, what are our weaknesses, what do we want to get better at. So these are all of the layers that you have to peel apart before you get to the point where communication really can happen effectively, which is why it makes all of this stuff so freaking hard, especially as teams build and noise increases.
Liz, can I add I want to share an anecdote of one thing that I've, in one sales, in my role in marketing, I'm often in sales meetings. In some companies I've worked in, like super large organizations, sometimes I'm under a same umbrella with sales too, right? So I sit in a ton of sales meetings, and I actually get to sit in them without being in the hot seat most of the time. So it gives me a chance to get this perspective over like really well run ones without like that same emotional like feeling that happens for a lot of people, like what's going to get brought up, how am I going to get called out, whatever. And one of my favorite examples that I've seen, and I've seen it done a few ways and a little bit different in different places, but is that cross between training and coaching when it's done in the sales meeting and when you involve peers. So in one-on-ones, you are recognizing, especially if you are doing that complimenting on a regular basis and looking for catching people doing good, right? And you are coming up with these different scenarios where somebody has done something really great, or maybe they've had something that was super challenging and they somehow got over it. And you sit in all those one-on-ones, or enough of them that you know this is a recurring problem for multiple people. Having that person getting them comfortable enough where they're willing to share, right? And then having that person come into the sales meeting and setting aside 5 minutes or 10 minutes of each sales meeting for this kind of training, coaching hybrid that's peer led, where you're moderating and driving this discussion, but you're letting the salesperson share their whatever they overcame, whatever their best practices, whatever that's working, right? And it's even better if there's something juicy and gnarly that was bad in the beginning and they turned it into something good, and everybody's experiencing it, right? And then letting the other people directly ask them questions. Well, wait, how'd you do this? Because this is the horror story I've dealt with. And really give it like backing out and not giving judgment around the questions that people ask, so that peers are helping rise the tide for all the other peers in the room. I find that takes it takes humility from the sales leadership to turn that over, right? But it also elevates a lot of salespeople who want to be recognized for their skills, right? In a way, in front of their peers. But it also improves trust, because this is somebody in the trenches who's dealing with the same problems, and even if you don't ask questions, you're hearing, right? So it's not just you, the sales manager, saying this is what you should do. You're hearing this is what your peers are doing. So even if you're resistant to it, it's going to get through in a different way.
So I think it's a good time to, again, to sort of differentiate some things. As a sales leader, you have different kinds of meetings or conversations. So you have these sales team meetings, and you have several different kinds of one-on-ones. You also have trainings that are group trainings. You may include your training in your team coaching, but you have other kinds of meetings with your individual sales reps. You have funnel reviews, you have coaching sessions, and you then also have sessions where you're talking about, um, are you hitting your goals, and what are you going to do to hit your goals? Maybe you're putting a PIP in place because somebody isn't hitting their goals, a performance improvement plan. So if we, as a sales leader, start to think about, there's these different kinds of meetings that I'm having, and what kind of behavior is happening in these different meetings. So I love the idea of having a sales meeting where we do a little bit of training. We also do a little bit of brainstorming together, right? Here's a problem I keep hearing in the funnel reviews. We're getting stuck here. How are you guys handling it? I keep hearing the same objection. Let's talk about it. What are some cool ways to handle it? Maybe somebody has a strategic account that they're trying to close and they can't. Let's do a funnel. Let's do an account plan in the meeting for 15 minutes, right? How do we use that time in a way that is not just, you guys, you got to hit your number, you got to hit your number, or everybody report. Let's take an hour with 10 of you and everybody report, and everybody else sit there quietly while everybody else is reporting, right? So if we think about, how do I best use the different kinds of meetings that I have to motivate my team toward the behaviors that I want them to have, I will be more successful. So if I think about that team meeting, what are the things that I can do that will inform and motivate? If I'm having a funnel review, what are the things that I can do that will be learning for both of us about what's going on, and maybe add a little coaching in? If I'm doing just a coaching session, hey, this happens often when we're doing a funnel review. Let's talk about, how do we address that? And then there's this last one, which is, you're not performing or you are performing. And if you're not performing, we have two ways to handle that. One is I can tell you what you're going to do. Two is we can come up with a plan together about how we're going to solve it. So as a leader, I have to think about, how do I want to address each of these activities? Am I telling? Am I learning? Or are we building it together? And which of those is going to motivate the team to achieve what I want them to achieve? And I don't think there's a right answer. Different times, different ways work better.
Yeah, I agree. So agree. The other a couple of words came up in this. One was coach, one was train. Another one that gets thrown out is mentor, and know which tool you're going to apply to the right situation based on the job to be done and purpose that you're trying to fulfill. Sometimes people get into the trap that's been talked about so far a couple of different times in different ways, where they believe that they're coaching, but actually what they're doing is training. And the worst ones, the worst ones are the situations where you join a member of your team and you think that you're going to help coach him up in a sales call, and instead what you do is you take over the call because you have to demonstrate the reason why you're in the room, and all that does is hurt the relationship that your rep has with their customer. It hurts the capability of that rep to go do the work that needs to be done, and it undermines your ability to continue to develop members of your team. So is the solution coaching, training, or mentoring? Do I have the right people doing those things? Is it being done at the right time, in the right order? And I mean, unfortunately, all of this stuff is really complex because we're dealing with human beings, and each of those humans has about 6 inches of gray matter between their ears. And a lot of times that gray matter is helping them think or feel different things than might ultimately be the reality.
I think the one thing that is clear, though, if we want to encourage motivate our team to do certain things, the philosophy of the whippings will continue until morale improves is not a good one, right? Being louder is not necessarily better. Saying it for the 35th time is not necessarily better. So we want to make sure that we are, we're motivating and encouraging, we're not beating.
Didn't we open up the whole conversation by saying we should beat them? I thought that's how we did that.
Well, and yell louder. Yeah.
Louder. Okay.
You guys
Okay,
forgot
so-
slower. Talk slower too.
So if I say it's slow enough,
There we go.
maybe you will understand.
Yes. Maybe I shouldn't be a coach. That's all we're going to say right there. Okay. So
Any last thoughts on this before we wrap up our day?
Since we're talking motivation, you started us off with this, and I'm gonna sort of bring us at least close to the close with make it fun. There's not enough fun, and again, I get to sit in a lot of different ones of these, particularly now with how working as a fractional CMO, right? More than when I was inside of companies, and I see a broader variety, and many are not fun. There's always room for a little fun.
agreed.
Well, thanks for joining us for this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. Your crew will be here next month, the second Friday on LinkedIn Live, and you can find us anywhere that where podcasts are available. You can find us and join us on our past episodes. Happy selling, everybody.